Stephen Millies teaches at Chicago's Catholic Theological Union. He's written an article about the lessons of the Berlin Wall, and he joins us now from Vancouver, Canada. Professor, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Let's begin with the role of St. John Paul II. He's credited with being a driving force in the downfall of the Soviet Union. How exactly did he accomplish that?
Well, I'm always cautious about giving credit to one person, of course. On the other hand, John Paul was an extraordinary person in an extraordinary circumstance. He'd had the experience of learning from the Nazi and then the communist domination of Poland about how to deal with an intractable enemy of Christianity. So I think we would want to pay attention to those elements in his biography, but we'd also want to pay attention to the historical forces that were always in play and that always worked against the Soviet Union and their project, both internally economically and externally in terms of their territorial ambitions around the world. Finally, though, we'd want to notice that just 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell, John Paul issued an encyclical Letter Centesimus Annus, where he, of course, pointed out the failures of the Soviet system, but turned his attention to the problems in Western political and economic life as well that were also dangerous to Christianity. He had a broad view that was focused on more than just Soviet communism.
So at the height of the Cold War, the world was divided into two, the United States in the West versus the Soviet Union in the East. After the wall fell 3 decades ago, there was hope for peace on the planet, but there isn't peace. What's gone wrong and what lessons should we have learned?
Well, the short answer is sin. We're human beings, and there's only so much peace and justice that I think we can hope for on our side of the eschaton before the second coming. But that all being said, I often think that we failed to heed the lessons that John Paul tried to teach us in that 1991 encyclical letter when he talked about the dangers of capitalism and the ways in which even Western social and political life fail to value the human person. Most of the time, I think we in the West looked at the end of the Cold War as a victory, as something we had won, and we've spent too much of the last 30 years, I think, feeling good about it rather than asking ourselves hard questions about how we should be building a better world.
Interesting. You've made the point that a just world depends on restraining power with the moral force of law. What must be done to make that a reality?
I come back to something Pope Francis talked about in one of his morning homilies, and which appeared in his recent document, Gaudete et Exsultate. He talks about the little gestures of humility, and he begins with the 3 right words. He calls them please, thank you, and sorry. And it's not as though saying those 3 right words will bring about world peace or justice, but they do get to the heart of the matter, and I think really the problem with how the U.S. and the West handled the end of the Cold War. What Francis is calling us to is always to remember to lead with humility, not to celebrate a victory, not to try to win something, and certainly not to celebrate when we do defeat someone, because that's a sort of a failure. We always have to begin down the road of humility, and the best way to do that is by beginning in our own lives with the 3 right words, please, thank you, and sorry.
So quickly, I want to ask you, where were you when the Berlin Wall fell, and what memories do you have of that momentous event?
I was a senior in high school in Chicago, Illinois, and I certainly can remember very well watching it on television. I wrote in the article about how we had heard, I had been reading, it had been in the news, that the Soviet Union might not be able to survive all that much longer. It was hard to imagine that something like that could be true, and yet very suddenly that night it was. I think many of us sensed everything had changed that night, but I think one of the reasons you and I are having this conversation today is we still don't understand what that change means. That's something we're still trying to figure out.
Stephen Millies of Chicago's Catholic Theological Union, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's been great. Thank you.
If you're watching Currents News on YouTube, be sure to hit the subscribe button and then click on the bell to get instant updates about all of our newest content, because we are putting your faith in the news.